Good morning, everybody. My name is Joe Hayes. I'm a research associate at the Public Policy Institute of California. Thank you for tuning into our program today, featuring the findings of our new PPIC report, Achieving Digital Equity for California Students. We would particularly like to thank our funder, the Michelson 20MM Foundation. We appreciate their support of this research and also of today's event. The report, as well as the slides from today's presentation, are available on our website at ppic.org. I want to mention that PPIC is a public charity, does not take or support positions on any ballot measure or legislation, nor does it support, endorse, or oppose any political parties or candidates standing for public office. For today's program, I will present first some key findings from the report, and then I'll hand the program over to my colleague and co-author Niu Gao to moderate a discussion with a great panel of experts that we've assembled. And finally, we have some time set aside at the end of the program for audience Q&A. If you have a question for our speakers about the report or the panel discussion, please send an email to the address on the screen. It's ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. And we would appreciate you including your name and organization along with your question. And with that, I will begin the presentation. At the onset of the pandemic in the United States, only 67% of California K-12 students had reliable access to computing devices. Access levels are particularly low among students who were low income, 52%, students who are Black, 58%, or students who are Latino, 61%. This is American Community Survey data from 2019. We've seen some improvement since then, and the improvement is most remarkable among Black, Latino, and low-income students, but as we'll see, there's a ways to go yet. We set out to look at how these discrepancies have changed over the course of the pandemic. What progress have we seen? What areas still need attention? And once we've quantified the problem, we set out to examine solutions, those that are occurring at the federal and state level in the form of legislation and public policy, and those undertaken by local entities like school districts, county offices of education, or county governments that may provide a model for larger solutions. I want to talk a little bit about the data that we used. We used Census household pulse survey data that included over 35,000 unique California households with children enrolled in school. And the timing of this goes from just about the beginning of the school shutdowns from the pandemic, April 2020, to the end of the most recent full school semester, spring 2021. So April 2020 to May 2021. And the two questions we focused in on are, was internet available in this household for educational purposes? And was an internet compatible device available for educational purposes? We were also able to look at equity factors that we're concerned with. So race, ethnicity, with Asian, Black, Latino, and white households identified. Household income, we identify low income as being less than $50,000 a year household income, and high income, as you'll see later on, we define that as over $100,000 per year. And also, we're able to disaggregate by educational levels. And here, we distinguish between households headed by somebody with a bachelor's degree or without a bachelor's degree. The Pulse survey also identifies 3 metro areas, and in the paper we disaggregate by metro area and give some geographical context. We're able to observe households in the San Francisco Bay Area, the Los Angeles metro area, and the Inland Empire, or specifically the Riverside, San Bernardino, Ontario metro area. I don't get to those here today, but those results are in the paper. All right. Excuse me for just a moment. Okay, so these are the percentages of households who responded that a device or an internet connection was available always, which is the requirement for reliable participation in distance learning. The question was asked whether these things were available never, sometimes, often, usually, or always. And for our standard to be able to fully participate, we need that access to be reliable. So device access was available always in 68% of households in spring 2020, and that rose to 82% in spring 2021. Internet access, reliable and always available, 71% in spring 2020, and that rose to 76%. And then to be fully engaged in distance learning, you really have to have both of those things. So households that responded that they had both internet and device always available went from 60% in spring 2020 to 71% by the end of the spring semester of the next year. So a pattern emerges where we see more noticeable gains in device access than internet access. And this is true in the aggregate, as you're seeing here, but also when we examine gains by income, education, and race ethnicity. Of course, to participate in distance learning, as I mentioned, the student needs to have access to both of those things. So the following results will just focus on internet and device access. Encouragingly, we see the most progress among groups that traditionally had the lowest access. For example, households headed by somebody without a bachelor's degree, that was 54% had access to both reliable internet and a device in 2020. This jumped to 66% in spring of 2021. Among low-income households, full digital access, as we're referring to it, rose from 44% to 59% during the same period. And full digital access among Black households jumped from 51% to 71% during the same period. And Latino households also saw an increase from 53% to 63%. So we've witnessed some progress. Some of the most identifiable equity gaps have shrunk, particularly among households with low income or low levels of formal education. The education gap, for instance, went from 23 percentage points to 15 percentage points, so it decreased by about a third. The income gap, as we've defined it, went from about 36 percentage points to 24 percentage points, so also decreased by about a third. But the disparities are still stark. 3 in 10 households overall still lack access to either reliable internet or a device, and the disparities along racial and ethnic and socioeconomic lines persist. Households of color in particular endure lower levels of digital access. Full access is 16% to percentage points lower for Latino households and 6 percentage points lower for Asian households compared to white households. The difference between white and Black households, as you see in the center of the graph, is 9 percentage points. So to sum up our findings, we find that a lack of infrastructure and then a lack of affordability where infrastructure does exist are the key barriers to universal broadband access. And our findings suggest that securing reliable internet tends to be a more persistent challenge than reliable access to a computing device. So we examined some efforts to expand infrastructure, and those include these federal and state measures at the top: the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, Coronavirus Capital Projects Fund, at the state level, Assembly Bill 156, and efforts to increase affordability include the Emergency Broadband Benefit and Emergency Connectivity Fund. We had the opportunity to talk to officials heading up local efforts to improve students' digital access, and we'll itemize a few of those here. The Imperial Valley Telecommunications Authority, operating out of the Imperial County Office of Education, established fiber optic network to provide internet service to over 120 educational and public agencies throughout the county. More recently, this is an effort going on over the last 2 decades, I should mention. More recently, in 2017-18, the county launched a pilot program to create an off-campus LTE network to bring high-speed wireless connectivity to students in local school districts. Not quite done with that yet. In Fresno Unified, the district leveraged its fiber optic infrastructure and its school buildings as platforms to deploy a private LTE service to students, particularly in the southern portion of the city that had lower connectivity. During phase 1 of this, the district deployed LTE at 15 school facilities as towers, covering about 20 square miles and supporting more than 6,500 concurrent student connections. Lindsay Unified School District, as many of you are aware, is a small rural district serving about 4,000 students in Tulare County. Starting in 2012-13, that district built a community Wi-Fi network to deliver high-speed internet to students at home. And the Ventura County Education Network, VCEdNet, is a federally registered internet service provider in and of itself that delivers internet connectivity and hosted services to school districts. And also, I should mention, charter schools and private schools, all within Ventura County. So what do we recommend, having learned what we've learned about these efforts? First of all, mapping we've identified is important. Mapping for identifying existing gaps. The FCC uses maps to allocate billions of dollars in subsidies, but it relies on data supplied by internet service providers whose maps can overstate access. Governor Newsom has signed an executive order to direct state agencies to improve their mapping and data efforts. Annual reports on student access. The state can direct schools and districts to report broadband access both in school and at home as part of its data collection efforts. For example, that kind of information could be included in LCAP, local control accountability plans, or school accountability report cards. Regarding subsidies, if and when federal subsidies expire, the state could commission a study to examine how the subsidy programs had been implemented, assessing the need for continued subsidies, and develop recommendations for the best path forward. And finally, coordinating efforts among state, local, and federal entities. Even before the pandemic, many of the local communities across the state had taken up the task of bridging the digital divide. And the 4 examples that we showed you, I should mention, have been longstanding efforts. So they're now ready to capitalize on federal and state investments to scale up and serve larger populations across the state. And they could provide a model for local groups who are just now starting down that path. And I should mention, we talked to a few others of those who've begun more recently, but have really shown some promise. So those are a few broad contours of what you'll find in the report. And now we're fortunate to have assembled a great panel of experts who can address some of these issues from a variety of perspectives. Please feel free to address questions about the report, again, or the panel discussion itself, using the email address ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. Thank you very much. I would like to now welcome the moderator for our panel discussion, my colleague and PPIC Senior Fellow, Niu Gao.
Thank you, Joe, for the presentation. Now I would like to welcome our distinguished panelists. Our speaker's bio may be found on the PPIC event webpage. So in the interest of time, we'll only do brief introductions today. Our first speaker is Marguerite Reardon. She is a senior reporter with CNET, where she covers broadband, digital divide, net neutrality, and many other tech issues. Our second speaker is Amy Tong. She is California's Chief Information Officer and the Director of the California Department of Technology. Amy also chairs the California Broadband Council. Our third speaker is Luis Wong. He is the Chief Technology Officer and the Imperial County Office of Education. He's also the CEO of the K-12 High-Speed Network. Welcome to all of the panelists. Let's start the conversation by talking about where we are in terms of the digital equity gaps. Our report shows that in the last year or so, we have reduced the digital equity gaps by about a third. Is this something more or less than you would have expected, and why? We can start perhaps with Amy and then move on to Luis.
Hello, everyone. Hi, Niu. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this STEAM panel along with Maggie and Luis. Happy to be here and sharing with you all with some of our thoughts and observation and a plan forward on how to continue to close the digital divide in California, specifically focusing on, I shouldn't say specifically, but a huge part of it is specifically focusing on the our school age population. And I think it's just as many of the information that was shared by Joe earlier, the state had unfortunately through this pandemic time have further proven the fact that the need or the disparity when it comes to the digital divide is affecting, area that we really should not be. And this is why moving forward, which we're going to go into a little bit more, I'm sure, the administration has made a huge investment with historic, statute with support of the legislature to really a rapid development on what needs to be done in bringing that service called Broadband for All to California. And I'm sure I'm going to circle back with a little bit more with the stats on what the specific focusing on the students and what the state has been doing. But I want to make sure I'm not hogging the time up front and let our panel member to jump in first before we dive in.
Amy, thank you for those kind comments, and thank you everyone. Thanks, Niu, for inviting us to be part of this panel. I want to say that I really want to congratulate you on your report. It's really well done, and I think it provides, put some numbers behind some of the things that we have consistently experienced here in Imperial County. Adoption rates have definitely increased. Back before pandemic, here in Imperial County, less than 50% of our students had access to a device. And that adoption really got accelerated by the pandemic. Now we're fortunate to have 100% of our students with a device. Broadband has been a challenge. California has put multiple efforts across the years to try to close the broadband gap. I certainly appreciate Director Tong's comments about an emphasis on the school community, because schools really provided an important safety net during the pandemic, offering things like food security, mental services, devices, and broadband during this pandemic. So really important, but yes, we do have to address the entire state, and that's also very important. So the findings were very consistent, I think, in terms of that adoption. And for California, I think it's an important opportunity with the pandemic to try to bring together the state, federal, local resources and really try to weigh in on this heavy issue in a coordinated fashion, because I think we've addressed it in pockets of innovations here and there. I could tell you with CDE, I've been working very closely with them in the last, since 2014-15, and we put some funds towards making sure every school had high-speed broadband. And we identified about 400 schools that didn't have or had deficits in connectivity. We've tackled a lot of those, but we had a lot of limitations being schools. And so I think it definitely got to a point where we needed to understand we needed a broader approach towards trying to solve broadband. So kudos to the state for putting some resources. Now we have to figure out how we leverage this with other resources that are out there.
Great, thanks. As Joe has alluded to, there are two key barriers to universal broadband access. The first is affordability, and the second is infrastructure. So how do we remove those barriers and respond to community needs? In the last year or so, we've seen some historical investments from the federal and also states. Have we seen any creative solutions, particularly for distance learning? Maybe we can start with Maggie.
Yeah, great. I just real quick want to touch on your previous question. One of the things that struck me about your research that I think is encouraging is that it looks like the gaps are narrowing a bit, and we saw some progress with low income and people of color, which I think is a good indication that maybe some of these programs are working. But it also seems like we need to keep working at it because those are the communities that are still have a big gap. So I think that's kind of important to note. And I think what you're seeing is a lot of, as we talked about, a lot of federal dollars coming, a lot of state dollars, and it's some states are using it really creatively. You talked about the mapping issue. I did a story in the spring about how school districts pretty much right when the pandemic hit, were the ones on the front lines going out and finding out where service was and where it was lacking. And, some districts, like a district I talked to in Washington State, was able to kind of funnel that information into the state, which then was able to funnel that into its database to try to figure out where to target resources. And then another state that I see doing some interesting things was Texas. Had a program, early on, they hit the ground running where they wanted to get one-to-one devices. So they used some CARES Act money to get devices out to all the students throughout the state. And then the next little bit of, the next thing that they tackled was really looking at like the broadband issue. How are we going to get broadband to these students? And so they, again, looking at federal dollars, looking at the $7 billion that was allocated by Congress for libraries and schools to extend broadband, they started looking at like, how can we sort of pull those resources and help bulk purchase broadband. And so they've got an effort underway to do that. So I think that there are a lot of school districts, a lot of states across the country who are taking the funds that are available from the feds and finding different ways to try to tackle the issue.
Great. Amy and Luis.
I guess I'll jump in next, Luis. I'll get it ahead of you. I think to Maggie's recap, I do believe that the biggest challenge when it comes to ability to connect, aside from the device, similarly California, Department of Education here, as Luis mentioned, that have did a very creative, bulk release of equipments or devices, I should say, into the hands of our student. But there is a challenge that cannot be solved overnight, and that is the broadband or the lack of broadband connection in many of the area that are either unserved or completely underserved. That is more than the ability to adopt at the household level, right? It's simply there's just no connectivity there, and that's where the investment is being made. A huge highlight idea, it's a historic 156 that have provided $6 billion in California to address both the middle mile initiative as well as the last mile to make sure the connectivity, excuse me, it's being provided. Excuse me, morning. To really bring the connectivity from a fundamental manner. This includes construction. This includes, getting to those hard to reach area that would have otherwise, no ability to reach to really fix it from the ground up. And that is what we are very, very excited about, to really solve this, hopefully once for all.
Absolutely. And, I would add that I think that there's not going to be a one size fits all solution here. I think we really need to be open to many approaches. I could offer you the perspective of rural communities, like Amy was saying, that where there is no infrastructure. And so in our instance, we basically developed our infrastructure so that we could serve the community. And we also need to not lose sight of making sure we provide quality service, because one of the things we realized is a lot of our families had internet access at home, but when it came down to three or four siblings trying to do distance learning and mom and dad working from home, it wasn't enough capacity for them to do what they needed to do, right? So we talk about quality, scalability of services. And you saw a lot of very creative ways to solve this. In some places, they leverage some of the subsidy programs that are now out there, which have helped a lot. And we're now understanding that there is a lot of need. Those funds are getting, really getting leveraged nationwide. There were some creative solutions all over the place. I think that in some cases, in Imperial County, we're very fortunate and blessed to have capacity, technical resources to run and operate a network. That's not necessarily true in many places around the state. So partnerships with providers and technical people that can bring those resources to work together. We saw some other models, like Maggie was alluding, towards more building purchasing consortia where districts would purchase in bulk and allow those costs to really go down. And then they would manage those connectivity options for the family. So I think that's a really good model, but it really is challenging a lot of the status quo and a lot of the models that are financial models and business models that are out there. So I think really, bottom line is, I think we have an opportunity to think outside the box. Traditionally, there's been some other funding sources from the state, like the California Advanced Services Fund, which has been traditionally for providers and carriers. And so, this hasn't really technically just been an issue around money. I think money is an important factor, but in a state like in California, which we're so diverse, the geography is a huge challenge. Weather conditions are a huge challenge, as we're just experienced this week. And then, rights of way and access and those sorts of things. So I think, we have to really look at this very broadly. And Amy alluded to this very eloquently. I mean, it is a very difficult thing to do.
And I just want to jump in because I think also we have to, Luis brought up a good point about, the quality of the broadband that is being provided. And it sounds like, there's some really creative, wonderful things that are happening. That's very cool that a school district is able to try to build out infrastructure, but you shouldn't have to, right? And that's where the policy really needs to come in, and some of this federal money that, if there are no networks available, right? It shouldn't be a school that has to go out there and build it themselves. That might be a stopgap for a year or two, but policymakers really need to be thinking, how can we get the broadband industry in there and actually providing service? Because it can be done and it should be done, and people should have access, and they should have access to good quality broadband too, at affordable rates. That's a whole nother issue.
Great. So today's event is very timely because right now Congress is continuing the discussion about the bipartisan infrastructure bill. The bill, if passed, will invest $65 billion in broadband. And given the size and also scope of the bill, if it passes, what are the implications for the digital equity gaps?
Yeah, so I can sort of leave it off on this because I've been following this. So yeah, I mean, this is a really big deal for broadband. So hopefully it doesn't all fall apart here at the last minute. But the bulk of that funding, the $42.5 billion, is really going to be for building out networks and providing equitable access. And I think this money, in combination with some money that's already been out there, can really make a difference in terms of getting that infrastructure built. We already have seen some previous federal dollars through coronavirus pandemic relief that's gone to states, and a lot of states have used that to their benefit to build in areas where they haven't. I did a story last year about Mississippi, and some of the CARES Act money got directed toward electric co-ops, some of which were already thinking about building out broadband networks, but that really helped kickstart the effort and got some more co-ops thinking about this. And, you've got a state like Mississippi that's at the bottom of education, at the bottom of broadband accessibility. And now you have rural parts of that state that are going to have access to gigabit speed broadband. I mean, that's transformative, right? So I think, this money, and this is really the biggest chunk of money that the feds have really ever put toward getting broadband infrastructure out there. And I think that, in combination with some of the other funding, can really make a difference in terms of getting this out there. So, but at the same time, I think if the bill falls apart, states are well on their way. So many states out there now know that they have to do something, and they're leveraging any kind of funding that they can get to try to get the problem solved.
Amy and Luis?
I'll jump in, Amy. I would just add that I think we definitely have opportunities, like Maggie was saying, to synergize on funding. I think that, if potential funding comes from the federal government, It would be interesting to see as well, you know, that with the federal government, you see multiple arms that provide resources, you know, even from USDA, you know, they have funding, and you talk to NTIA, so all these pockets of funding. And so hopefully we can streamline those so that they're focused. And then, you know, important for our states, you know, how do we leverage the $6 billion that are being invested in middle mile here in California to stretch those investments and make them worthwhile? I also think we don't need to lose track of how do we sustain this infrastructure. Programs like the Universal Service Fund is very important to keep these things going. I've heard multiple times from carriers, and we had some local experience about saying, well, you know, even if I build the infrastructure, I have not enough subscribers to maintain it and sustain it, right? And so this is where these programs like the Universal Service Fund are very important to fill those gaps. So I think we have to really look at this very comprehensively, because the last thing we want to do is invest tons of billions of dollars into this, and then, you know, you know, it doesn't pencil out at the end of the day.
Yeah, and that's very well said, Louis. And I think this is to the point that, you know, Maggie is correct. There's tons of funding, and then there's a tons of desire, and then everybody's feel the sense of urgency in order to you know, like, connect everywhere, right? Like this infrastructure needs to happen. And in fact, we call it, this digital infrastructure it's a necessity now. Is no longer a luxury, is no longer an option. It's just like, you know, the utilities, powers, like everybody needs to have it. It's their basic way of operation or conducting, you know, the well-being of their family, especially when it comes to school kids. But to Louis' point, that I think not to rush into a situation and build for the sake of build, and it's really take the time, and this is what the state at this very moment is focusing very much on, to go through very good data analysis, and that's is alluded to the research paper that Joe shared earlier, based on good solid data, and that data has to come from the industry, have to come from our internet service provider, to really inform the state where the area that requires to build, where the area perhaps requires some type of a boost or enhancement, where the area that the challenge is in the middle mile, where the area that the challenge is the last mile, which, you know, those providers could also be very, very diverse. And adding to top of that, have an economic model. And I think Maggie alluded to, but I think is a very relevant point, even though we're not going to go into it today, is really the affordability to all of this. Economically, you know, that has to be, you know, sustainable, so that, you know, you don't make all of these investment up front, but have no way to sustain it going forward. The last thing you want is to have a network, but not keeping it up. And then, you know, 2 years later, we're already out or behind in terms of the speed and the quality that's needed to support. So not to sound daunting, it was like all of these are up in the air, but I think this is one of those once in a generation, perhaps one in a lifetime, that we have to make, you know, apply good strategy, smart investment, and smart implementation approach to make sure that we've got to do this right. On top of that, that sense of urgency, it should not take another 5 years. And we better not have this conversation again in another 5 years about digital divide and all that. And that's why having forum as such this and focusing on the K-12 as our, you know, future, we got to do everything we can in the rapid but strategic manner to make sure those infrastructure services are in place. And that's where we're just very, very excited about.
Great. So we just doing a time check. We are going to begin audience Q&A in a few minutes. So as a reminder, please submit your questions to ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. So let's get back to the panel discussion. So it looks like universal broadband access will be very essential to an inclusive education, economy, and also society. And right now, given all of those unprecedented historical level of investments, what kind of actions should the federal, state, and also local entities take in order to close the remaining gaps in the longer term?
So I think as we talked about, we've got this big pile of money that we're hoping the federal government will come forth with the infrastructure bill. But also, Luis mentioned the Universal Service Fund. And, that is somebody who's been covering the FCC for, almost 2 decades. I mean, that's a system that's broken, right? The contribution for universal service is really not sustainable. It's basically long distance calling is what funds Universal Service Fund, and that has a bunch of programs to help low income folks get connected, and also to help those rural carriers stay connected and keep and upgrade their networks. And so that needs to be reformed. And the problem has been it's basically a third rail in terms of political will to get something done. So that's a real big challenge for the FCC. They're going to have to tackle that. And then you've got like the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program, which is a subsidy program that was really just for the pandemic. And now that's being in this new legislation, if it gets through, gets through the House and gets through and signed, is that would make that subsidy permanent. It would be a $30 a month subsidy for folks. And the question is, was the initial EBB really successful? We don't know. I mean, it's I think going to be important to also assess how those subsidy programs have worked, whether people have been able to access that, whether the right people have been able to access that, and then what are the rules going to be for a new subsidy program, and will we have the political will going forward to continue funding that? So I think those are all sort of important questions that have to be answered to see, where we go from here.
So I would offer Niu that, from the federal perspective, funding is important, but I think policies to help remove barriers and silos are going to be very important as well. One of the issues that we deal a lot with is issues of rights of way and the red tape and how cumbersome it is, especially here in California. We'll say that it is very challenging to get through permitting and those sorts of things. And I see the carriers, traditional carriers, struggling a lot with this. Also, I think going back to rural communities where possibly putting a lot of this fiber everywhere doesn't make any sense. Allowing for other solutions, perhaps spectrum that could be afforded to some of these areas where a wireless technology could be deployed more readily at a lower entry cost, a lower entry point. From the state perspective, I think there's definitely opportunities to develop further relationships with folks. A lot of these, one of the things that we tell in Imperial County is our secret sauce is the relationships we have at the local level, because we collaborate with counties, city officials, Caltrans. We know everybody knows each other. We're small communities, and so we work together towards a common goal. And I think that's going to be extremely important as we move forward at the state and the local level. So we can look at and talk about these coordinated infrastructure builds as well. And at the local level, I would say that, I think it's an opportunity to empower them, because in some cases the carriers will have the solutions, but in some cases it'll be up to the local folks to come together, like the local co-ops that Maggie mentioned. We're an example of that, where they are municipality or government agencies that are sophisticated in technology and could provide services if they're afforded the same opportunities as some of the other providers out there.
Yeah, maybe I'll just wrap this piece up. And I know knew that we wanted to go to the Q&A. I think both Maggie and Luis have really spelled out from a federal, state, and local level. So I'll just pile on that with things to say that with this historic investment with the $6 billion, it is not up to the state alone. It cannot be the state alone to make that happen, right? And even within the state by itself, working with the California Public Utilities Commission, Caltrans, who's going to be responsible for the bill. Public utilities are responsible to really get a lot of these comments through their public proceeding. It is really comment from the local community, the industry, and all of those that has been affected in this, both positively and negatively, to really provide ideas. And then aside from the idea, it's about streamlining all of the barriers by removing them to the extent possible, but streamlining the process, as Luis mentioned, the permitting side of it. What can we do to move faster on those in order for almost like an express lane that needs to be provided to make this happen? And there's going to be trial and error that's going to be involved, right? There's maybe some ways that the rural area, it's a good example. If it's too hard to build there, maybe there's other options. And are those options going to be sustainable to meet the increasing demand? All those need to be planned. At the end of the day, I think we have to look at this broadband infrastructure as a next generation innovative approach to make that happen. And it's almost in a way, I would even say it's almost in the catch-up mode, that we have to just go faster in order to catch up what have so many family due to this divide have been lagging in terms of their access to information and to services. A long-winded way to wrap it up, just saying that I know the commitment is there at the state level, and I have heard so many and really appreciate all the commitment of the locals willing to help out. That's local entity as well as local communities. And then of course that as we're monitoring closely how on the federal side, this new funding bill is going to hopefully have some results soon. The sustainability of this funding, especially in that particular program, that EBB that Maggie has cited, it will provide a boost of confidence that a lot of these measures is not a temporary fix. And I think that is the sense of confidence we as a governmental entity needs to provide to our residents in the state as well.
Yes, so implementation is going to be key. Planning and also coordination among federal, state, and also local governments will be key to solving the digital divide gaps. So now we thank you to all of the speakers for a great discussion. We would like now to go ahead and answer some questions from our audience. And also, I would like to welcome my colleague, Joe Hayes, back to the program.
Hello.
So the first question is going back to the infrastructure problem, particularly in the rural areas. So one question is, how can rural areas advocate? So for example, students cannot connect video and also audio at the same time, and service is largely non-existent outside of town. And also in rural areas, they do not have city or state government capacity to be very competitive in grant writing or gaining legislative attention. So how do we solve this problem in rural areas? How can they advocate?
I think one approach would be, certainly work. I've seen this happen like in the areas of Colusa County where they're working closely with partners, private partners, to try to, solve this problem, especially if there's no technical resources out there. For rural community, and the wireless issue, it is a problem. One of the things we saw during the pandemic is a lot of the carriers were really gracious to provide hotspots for some of our students, but while it helped tremendously, it really didn't help as much from the infrastructure perspective, because it's the equivalent of adding more vehicles to an already congested highway. And so really the conversation should have been, how do we expand those highways? How do we provide more capacity so that we can provide this distance learning? This whole pandemic and distance learning is any provider's worst nightmare, where you have these networks are not designed for having hundreds and thousands of people connected at the same time with the demand of 2 to 3 to 5 megabits per second that it requires for technologies like this, the webinars and the and doing distance learning. So this is why we're talking about quality, and you get that quality by having access to things like spectrum. To Amy's comment in the earlier, I will say that there are some other emerging technologies. We should, consider things like a low orbital satellite. Those seem to be promising technologies that may have a space for these types of places. And those technologies are maturing. I don't think they're ready 100% yet, but I know they're piloting those kinds of things. And I think we should be open to a lot of these discussions as we move forward.
Yeah, I just want to hop in though, and maybe I'll wireless low orbit satellite, those are promising technologies, but I think at the end of the day, what people don't recognize is, like, for example, for spectrum to be useful and valuable, you have to have fiber somewhere, right? Because the internet, it doesn't stay in the air very long, right? It has to go into the ground somewhere. So I think even in these rural areas, there has to be a much bigger push to get fiber deeper into those communities and out to those communities. Because if you're going to try to leverage any kind of last mile wireless, you're really going to need that. The satellite technology, I'll be honest with you, it's not there yet. And I don't know if it's ever going to be there yet. And I think that is going to probably be a solution for like the very hardest places to reach. And there will certainly be some of those, but I think communities shouldn't give up on this idea that they want, more fiber in their communities in some way, shape, or fashion. And, and I think that's also a real policy discussion that I think the federal government can sort of help with in terms of setting the bar that, wireless isn't always going to be able to provide you the same kind of quality and the same kind of sustainability that something like fiber could. And so we have to make sure that that people who are in these communities aren't getting kind of second-class broadband.
Yeah, I'll just add on the fact that actually on AB 156, there was a special dedicated reference or mentioning that a rural area connection has to be a focus. So I want to echo the comments by Maggie and Luis, that don't feel ever discouraged or the question raised that, like, we don't have the resources, how do we lobby? It shouldn't be, up to you to lobby to know that you need the assistant, right? There is a public process. The CPUC, California Public Utility Commission, is taking a lot of public comment. And what we really need is good data and good map to really showcase and demonstrate, display where those area of underserved and underserved are. And based on that, then we take all the investment necessary to close those gaps, and yes, including laying out the fiber to the extent possible. And I would say to Luis is that this is not just even the highway, expanding the highway lane, it's the highway connection to the local street, some of them even more winding than the other, to get to those community. So it's the entire infrastructure.
Great. So we have a couple of questions talking about the impact of the digital divide on K-12 students and also college students. We've seen that some of the schools and also colleges across the states, suffered enrollment decline due to some of the connectivity issues. And we've talked about, what's going on in the K-12 and what some of the solutions have been tried. So can you talk a little bit about what is being done to help college students with greater access and also affordability to close their digital divide?
I can offer just the brief, nothing elaborate, but our local wireless initiative, what is available for our college and our K-12. So we were fortunate to be able to expand that, and we had close to 300 college students that are benefiting currently today from our wireless initiative. So there is a concern statewide and locally. I hear a lot of concerns about enrollment and declining enrollment. Students that are definitely that don't have access to the tools are, dropping off.
And I think the question really also is, is that happening because of a lack of infrastructure and access or affordability? And if it's an affordability issue, then, the subsidy programs, how is it getting to the right people that need it, right? Are people, I know, for example, with the EBB program, that's the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program the FCC is running, there are a lot of hoops that you have to go through to be able to qualify. And so, really walking people through that and even being aware of the program. I mean, Lifeline, which is a Universal Service Fund program, is a subsidy program that's existed since the 80s. Now, it's not a huge subsidy. It's $10 a month. You can use it for wireless or you can use it for broadband, but a lot of people don't even know about it or how to, find out if they qualify for it. So I think that's another thing that really needs to happen, is getting the word out about these programs and helping people find out if they qualify and enrolling. And I think one of the aspects there that we haven't addressed yet is who's going to be doing that effort. Right now, there's a lot of local nonprofits that are doing it, but they don't have the funding to go out there and do it. So, that's also an aspect of either state funding or federal funding, really recognizing that we need boots on the ground, and some of these community organizations need to be involved, but they can't just do it for free. Somebody has to provide the funding for them to be able to do the work.
Yes, absolutely. So the awareness is going to be really important in closing or increasing some of the affordability. So in terms of the EBB, Emergency Broadband Benefit Program, FCC estimates that in the US, about 34 million households were eligible. But so far, we've only seen 6 million households sign up for it. And in California, the take-up rate is also, about an average. And we also know some of the counties with very low take-up rate happens to be those counties with very large, underserved populations, such as indigenous populations. So this is a great segue to the next question, in terms of talking about the resources awareness. So one question was, where and also how communities of color can find out about those funding opportunities available to assist with building equity.
So one thing, and I don't know if this is happening yet, but I think it is happening in certain pockets, and I think more of it needs to be happening, particularly to address those communities, is working with, so-called anchor institutions like a school, right? Like public housing authorities, and really not even just saying here's how you sign up for a subsidy, but just sort of bundling those services into what you do. So, if you're a family that has your child enrolled in school, you don't even have to sign up for broadband. It's you just get it. The school knows where you live. They facilitate something to happen with, broadband provider. They pay the cost potentially of you getting that broadband. And it's just sort of all tied in together. And, there are some places where they're exploring that. And, it'd be interesting to hear, what the other panelists think about something like that. But I think that could go a long way in breaking down barriers, because, people don't have to fill out a bunch of forms, or maybe they already have. Maybe they already are qualifying for free or reduced lunch, and therefore they're already in the school system's, database for that, or they're, a public housing resident and they're already getting public subsidy. So I don't know, what did the other folks think about that?
Yeah, I'll jump in. And in fact, this is a very topic, and just Niu specifically using the EBB as an example, right, on how to get this information. And I think the question is more of just generally, all of these resources, how do you make known to people? I think there's two things that we really need to focusing on. One is, if the information already made it to somebody's hand, then the barrier from entry, simplifying the application form, simplifying the way to get signed up, those will go a long way to increase the adoption rate of using those subsidized services. The other, I think, is a huge area that we often forget, is because we're so used to have access to text, to email, to check on a website. We're talking about people that don't have ways to get access to those, and yet those are still being used as a traditional channel to distribute information. Hello, something is missing. So what happened? Why can't we go back to, I'll call it the more traditional, like door to door, knock on the door, pass out flyers or get to a community, work with a local community organization and church and all to get that information out. Yes, it takes more work. Yes, it takes more mobilization of what I call the ground cover, canvassing places go to. But that is absolutely necessary in order to get these valuable information to the community that are really, really needed. And that is something that I think we can always do more of.
Great. So we've seen a few questions were about digital redlining. So we know that this affects, Black and Latino students in urban areas such as Oakland and also Los Angeles. And some students, in those areas, they may be already a few years behind in terms of digital divide. So how do we address this? Maybe we can start with Maggie. And before you talked about the solutions, can you maybe give our audience a quick overview of what is digital redlining and also why is this a big deal?
Yeah, so digital redlining is basically, sort of the carry-on effect of, what we think of as traditional redlining, which has been outlawed, right? So at the turn of the century, we had communities of color where people weren't able to get mortgages, they weren't able to get insurance, those kinds of things, because providers were discriminating against those particular sections of town. And so what we find today is, even though that's been outlawed for years, right? You can't reject someone for getting a mortgage based upon their race or, where they live. We see it happening in broadband, where if you kind of look at the maps of a city like Cleveland, for example, Cleveland, Ohio, you'll see that like where there was mortgage redlining in the 1940s, those same communities now don't have broadband. And the reason why is because those have been traditionally marginalized, poor communities, and the providers haven't seen them as places where they can make money. And so they don't provide service there. And it's a big, big problem. And we see some, policy advocates and some work being done where you have, again, like public housing authorities that are partnering with some providers to just sort of bundle access into to public housing, or they're providing a really reduced cost and they sort of streamline the process for getting broadband. So that is an aspect. Part of this legislation that, might get passed also addresses some of the concerns about digital redlining and trying to form policies and make providers actually, if they're going to get federal subsidies, they have to be able to deliver service in those areas. So I don't know if other folks have stuff to say about, but it's a huge problem. People often think of lack of access in just rural communities. But, if you look at inner cities, it is a huge problem. And it's not even just sometimes that service isn't available. It could be available, but it could be really bad service, right? And that whole idea of equity and why is it okay for people, who live in a certain section of town who predominantly are brown and Black, why are they getting a lesser service than folks who live in the suburbs, perhaps, right? And that's a policy issue that really needs to be addressed.
Great. I wish we could continue the conversation, but unfortunately, we have reached the end of the programs. I would like to thank my colleague Joe for his great presentation, and also thank you to our panelists for a very thoughtful and inspiring conversation today. We will also like to thank our funder, the Michelson 20mm Foundation, for their generous support, and thanks to all of you for joining us today online. If you pre-registered for this event, later today you will receive a survey. We would appreciate it if you could take a couple of minutes to respond and let us know how we did. Thanks again, please be safe and have a great afternoon.